Thank you very much. So before I talk about children's past lives, I want to tell just for a second, talk about how our division and how all of this work got started. It started, as Pat had mentioned, with Ian Stevenson. Ian came to the university to be chairman of the Department of Psychiatry in 1957. And at that point, he was in the middle of a perfectly successful mainstream career. In fact, he was still in his late 30s when he came to be chairman. And when he interviewed, he told people that he had an interest in parapsychology. But he had a lot of other interests as well, and nobody seemed to mind. And then a couple of years later, he wrote a paper about previous reports of people describing memories of a past life. And after that paper was published, he started hearing about cases of children who were reporting memories of a past life, and he decided to start investigating them and went around the world investigating these cases. He was able to fund the trips because of the financial help of Chester Carlson. Carlson invented the Xeroxing process, so he was quite wealthy, obviously, and he read Ian's first paper and became interested in it and started offering financial support. And Ian actually initially turned him down because he was so busy running the department, but eventually got more and more interested in these cases and then stepped down as chairman of the department in 1967 and started this Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS. And with the help of other donations and bequests over the years, we've been going ever since. So next year will be 50 years. For Ian, he spent the bulk of the next 40 years, the last 40 years of his life, investigating these cases. And he published numerous papers and books about them. One of his books was reviewed in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the reviewer, who was actually the book review editor, wrote, "In regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. He has placed on record a large amount of data that cannot be ignored." Now, the latter part of that turned out not really to be true in the sense that many people did ignore it. But that did not deter Ian, and he continued with the work, and he also worked to get other researchers involved. One of the criticisms of his work was that he was the only one finding these cases. And that was certainly not his fault. But then he eventually got several psychologists and an anthropologist involved in studying them independently. Then I came on later as a child psychiatrist. I got intrigued and eventually called up the division and asked to volunteer some time, and kind of one thing led to another. And I've been full-time at UVA since 2000. So now that we've been studying these cases actually for over 50 years, we have collected over 2,500 cases from around the world. And here's the list of countries where we have the most cases, and it's cultures with a belief in reincarnation. But the reason these particular countries stand out is because we've had associates looking for them there. And in fact, cases have been found wherever anyone has looked. They've been found on all the continents except Antarctica, where we have not yet looked. And they're also found here in the West, and they may be less common here. They're certainly harder to find, but it may just be that families don't tell anyone when their children are saying these things like they might in other places. And I'm going to tell you about an American case in a little bit that is quite interesting. So as far as these cases go, looking at the features of them, these are very young children who spontaneously start talking about a past life. This work does not involve hypnotic regression, but rather young children. When I say young, The average age when they start talking about a past life is 35 months. So it's usually a 2 or 3-year-old who starts coming out with these things. And usually by the time they're 6 or 7, they stop. But in the meantime, they will sometimes every day talk about a life, typically a recent ordinary life. They are not talking about being kings or queens. They almost never talk about being a famous person, but instead somebody perfectly ordinary who lived usually in the same country and often even fairly close by. And when I say a recent life, the average interval between the death of the previous person and the birth of the child is 4.5 years. The median interval, meaning half are shorter and half are longer, is only 16 months. So they're typically extremely recent lives. Now, there are exceptions to that, and the example I'm going to give you is an exception. Some of them talk about being a deceased family member, but others describe being strangers in other locations. And if they give enough details like the name of that location, then people have often gone there and found that, in fact, somebody did live and die whose life matches the details that the child gave. In that situation, we say it's a solved case. If a child talks about a past life, but no one can verify that the details match anyone who actually lived, then it's unsolved. We have plenty of both kinds in our collection, but 2/3 of our cases are solved. And, of course, they tend to be the more interesting ones. The one part of the past life that is often out of the ordinary is how the previous person died. In 70% of the cases, the previous person died by unnatural means, meaning murder, suicide, combat, accident, those sorts of things. That certainly seems to be an important factor in this phenomenon. Now, for the kids who die violently, many of them are born with birthmarks or birth defects that match wounds, usually the fatal wound, on the body of the previous person. And Ian, who was, before he got involved in any of this, was interested in psychosomatic medicine, so the connection between mind and body. And he was really fascinated by these cases where somehow an injury from a past life shows up on a new baby's body. So he spent years collecting these cases and then years more writing them up. And he eventually published this book called Reincarnation in Biology. It's a 2-volume set that's over 2,000 pages long, and it describes over 200 such cases. I will now review all 200 with you. I may run over my 20-minute time allotment. Now, I'll tell you about a couple of them. There's a girl who remembers the life of a man who got his fingers chopped off as he was being murdered, and the girl was born with her hands looking like that. There was a case of a boy who remembered the life of a boy in another village who had lost the fingers of his right hand in a fodder chopping machine. And the second boy was born with his hands looking like that. There was a boy who remembered the life of a man who had been killed by a shotgun blast to the side of his head. And this boy was born with a stump for an ear, and actually half of his face was underdeveloped. Ian also lists 18 cases in which children were born with two birthmarks, ones that match both the entrance wound and the exit wound on the body of gunshot victims. So I eventually decided to focus on American cases. I took several trips to Asia, but I decided to focus on the American ones for a couple of reasons. One, they don't have the potential cultural influences that might impact the cases from Asia. And two, I felt like that they could have more impact on people, that they could be harder to dismiss if you realize that it could be happening to the kid down the street. So one in particular that I want to tell you about is one that has gotten a fair amount of press. You may have heard about it. A little boy named James Leininger. The case has been on TV some. His parents eventually wrote a book about their experiences. He's a boy who talked about being a pilot who was killed during World War II, and it's believed that that pilot has now been identified. So his parents are this Christian couple in Louisiana, and his dad in particular was quite opposed to the idea of past lives before this case began. It began when James was 22 months old, and he and his dad took a trip to a flight museum. And James was fascinated by the exhibit of World War II planes to the point that he kept insisting that they go back to it, and he and his dad ended up spending 3 hours at the museum when he was 22 months old. And then a couple months later, around the time of his second birthday, he started having horrible nightmares multiple times a week in which he would be kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And after I spent a weekend with the family going over all the details of the case, and then afterwards I talked with his aunt, who had spent a lot of time with the family. She said you cannot believe how horrible these things were to witness, that it really looked like somebody fighting for his life. And then during the day, he would take his toy airplanes and he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," and he would slam them nose first, bam, into the coffee table. He would do this over and over again, and his parents are apparently tolerant people. Because this is a picture of their coffee table. I don't know how well you can see it, but there are dozens of scratches and dents where he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," bam. So that looks very similar to what we in children's mental health call post-traumatic play, where a child who has experienced or witnessed something traumatic then reenacts the scene over and over again in their play. And when you combine that with his nightmares, he really looks like a child who had been traumatized, but he had not been, at least in this life. And he didn't, but many of the children who describe violent lives show phobias as well. In the unnatural death cases, over 35% of the kids will have an intense fear toward the mode of death. And the other thing that a lot of the kids will do in their play, they will also reenact compulsively the occupation of the previous person. And in James's case, not only did he play with his toy planes a lot, but he took an old car seat and created a cockpit in the closet of his dad's home office. So his dad would be in there working, and James would come tumbling out of the closet as he was parachuting out of his plane. And then his parents were able to have several conversations with him after his second birthday in which he could talk about this stuff while he was awake. What he described was that his plane had crashed on fire, that he had been shot down by the Japanese, and that he flew a Corsair. Now, I'd never heard of a Corsair, but it was a special plane that was developed during World War II. And after this case got some publicity, skeptics said, well, he just saw a Corsair at the museum and the name stuck with him. And in fact, if you go to the website of the Flight Museum, you see that in fact there is a Corsair there. Now, James's dad said there was not one there when he and James visited, so I looked into it and found that in fact his dad was correct. They had a Corsair. It had crashed at a public air show the year before they visited, and then they didn't get a replacement for 3 more years. So that is not where he learned about Corsairs. He also said that he flew off of a boat, and his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma, which I think we can all agree would be quite an unusual name to guess for a U.S. aircraft carrier. And in fact, his dad responded, well, that sounds Japanese to me. And James said, no, it was American. So after that conversation, Dad went and did an online search and eventually came across information on the USS Natoma Bay. He printed out the information, and the footer shows the date right here. When he printed it out, 8/27/2000. James was born in April of '98, so this documents that by the time he was 28 months old, that Natoma was part of the story. And it turned out that the USS Natoma Bay was an escort carrier that was, in fact, stationed in the Pacific during World War II. His parents would also ask him who he was during all this, and he always just said me or James, which they didn't make anything of at the time. They also asked him one time who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. This was all when he was 2. Now, when he was 2.5, his dad bought a book on Iwo Jima to give to his dad, James's granddad. And he was looking through it one day, and James came and got it in his lap, and they were thumbing through it when they came to a page with a picture of Iwo Jima on it. And James pointed at it and said, "That's where my plane was shot down." And his dad said, "What?" And he said, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And his dad was just floored that his 2.5-year-old was talking like this. And then he learned that, in fact, the Natoma Bay did take part in the Iwo Jima operation. Then when James got old enough to draw, he drew, according to his parents, dozens, if not hundreds of pictures of airplanes and battle scenes, and he would always sign them James 3. Now, I thought that might be because he was 3 years old, but his parents said, no, they asked him, and he said, "I'm the third James, I'm James 3. And in fact, he continued to sign them that way even after he turned 4. So with all this going on, his parents did begin to wonder if he could be remembering a past life. So when he was 4.5, his dad attended a Natoma Bay reunion, and he learned that there had been a Jack Larson there. He had been looking for a Jack Larson among the war dead, but in fact this Jack Larson had survived the war and was even still alive. So James's dad went and visited him, and he learned that he was on the ship, on the Natoma Bay, during the Iwo Jima operation. He also learned that one and only one pilot from the ship was killed during the Iwo Jima operation. This was a 21-year-old pilot from Pennsylvania named James Houston. So this means if James Leininger was in fact remembering a past life, it had to be Houston's life because he was the only pilot from the Natoma Bay killed at Iwo Jima. So what we can do is compare what James said with Houston's life. Now, his parents say that he also talked about family life before the war, but we don't have any documentation of those statements that was made before Houston was identified. But what I can do is list all the items where we have definite documentation that was made before anyone knew anything about James Houston. Much of it comes from an interview that the Leiningers did with ABC News, again, before anyone knew if James's statements actually matched an actual pilot. So James signed his drawings James 3. Houston was James Jr., which would make James Leininger the third James. James said that he flew off the Natoma. Houston was a pilot on the USS Natoma Bay. James said he flew a Corsair. Houston had flown a Corsair. He was actually flying a different plane when he was killed, but he was part of the squadron that had tested the Corsair for the Navy. James said he was shot down by the Japanese, and Houston was shot down by the Japanese. James said he died at Iwo Jima. Houston was the one Natoma Bay pilot killed during the Iwo Jima operation. James said one day, quote, "My airplane got shot into the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." Eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was, quote, hit head-on right on the middle of the engine. James had nightmares of a plane crashing and sinking in the water. Houston's plane crashed in the water and quickly sank. And James said that Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was the pilot of the plane next to Houston's on the day that he was killed. James is now 18 years old. He became an Eagle Scout, and he graduated from high school this spring, and he has recently joined the Navy. With that, I will stop, and I will turn it over to Dr. Penberthy.